Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi. This episode is about where we are, where we're going, and how you can get there expeditiously. You do need to know where we came from, gather insights from our more distant and recent pasts, and what we have been experiencing and exploring since crisis conditions ended. There are no cookie-cutter solutions during periods of significant transformation. No fixed forms we can fit into and settle back upon. Re-centralizing control hinders growth. Flexing forward and sharing responsibilities across the workforce allow adjustments for the ongoing change. That is one constant we can be sure of. There are core and consistent principles and themes to guide us, embracing our new realities, recognizing employees' successful responses, pivots, and practices during emergency conditions, despite unprecedented limitations. As we have re-emerged, drawing upon important learnings, especially where long-standing issues were exposed, we can design and build appropriately for what's next. That is why I'm delighted to be talking to Brian Elliott, a veteran executive leader, advisor, speaker, and best-selling author. After several years in leadership at Slack, Brian co-founded and was the executive leader of Future Forum, the think tank backed by Slack in partnership with BCG, Miller Knoll, and Management Leadership for Tomorrow. Brian's book, How the Future Works, Leading Flexible Teams to Do the Best Work of Their Lives, is highly relevant as we explore how to design and optimize our new ways of working. Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm great. It's a wonderful morning here. Thanks for having me, Sophie.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. I like to start at the beginning, and you started out as a case writer at Harvard Business School. How did you end up doing case studies?
Boston Consulting Group hired me out of undergraduate college for a couple of years, and then I went to Harvard Business School and ended up writing cases over the course of the summer between the 2 years. Partly because the faculty in a particular group, technology and operations management, were fantastic, but also because I wanted to explore whether or not I wanted to be a professor. They've been chatting with me about it. I have a math background, economics, all this other kind of geeky analytic stuff, and really a fascination with research as well. But over the course of that summer, I pretty quickly figured out that the case study aspects, the writing of the story, was a lot of fun. But in talking with people who'd gone through the process, while I loved research and getting into it, the depth you have to go to in the sort of sticking with one subject didn't fit really well with my ADD. From a personality perspective, that wasn't going to be a place where I was going to end up being very happy. I loved doing sort of side teaching with some of my classmates. I loved the process of writing a good story from a case perspective. But boy, I tell you, if you want to be a professor, you better be prepared to go deep and stick with a subject matter for a long period of time.
Okay, so BCG did that for a while, and then you went to Alibris?
Alibris.
What was it that you discovered about yourself, or what particularly interested you at BCG that then took you to an e-commerce company?
If there's a through line through my entire career, it's continuous learning and putting myself into situations where I was going to be at least a little, if not a lot, uncomfortable, but where I was going to learn and grow and develop. And so, at BCG, I had a great experience, but I also found myself after a few years really having the itch to be an operator, to build something myself, to put my hands on it. I had a great client, a woman who ran a company who I spent a lot of time with talking about her team and operations and what was working and what wasn't, and really enjoyed and loved those conversations more than I did the work that I was doing. And so late 90s, Web 1.0 bubble, time to get out into the operating world. And so
Got it.
I jumped into Alibris, which was e-commerce, and in a space that was, questionable even at the time, because I also would get operating experience. Had a boss, a guy named Marty Manley, who took a chance on giving, a smart aleck kid out of a consulting firm a P&L and responsibility for a sales team. I learned a lot the hard way. I was not a good leader. I was not a good manager by any stretch of the imagination.
And how do you feel that showed up? An issue right now is about the challenge of people not being trained as managers and the fact that most people aren't good managers. How did you learn that about yourself?
Oh, it didn't take long, luckily. And I got some help along the way, especially from a woman named Mariah DeLeon, who was my HR, my people partner.
Okay.
But I was, your classic post-consultant, analytical rigor, the right answer, and kind of an arrogant jerk, to be honest. And Mariah was kind enough at one point to take me aside and say, "Brian, you're kind of an arrogant jerk," except she used a more colorful term for it at that point.
All right.
And she was right. And I could see it too in some of the behavior of other people I was working with. The head of engineering and I were not getting along because I was insisting on this is the right way to do things. And I was probably a good decade or so younger than him, less experienced, had never been in an operating company before.
Also with engineering, there's so many ways you can ask a question and you don't get an answer. You haven't asked the right question, or you haven't asked the question in a way that they can actually answer it.
Yeah, or hadn't even the problem that I was trying to solve as opposed to giving him a solution, right? And so I wasn't inviting him into the conversation. I was being, here's the right way to go. And similarly, like I did not know how to lead and operate a sales team. Luckily, I'd hired somebody who helped me figure that out. And, it was school of hard knocks, but it was very much, getting out of that, analytical rigor will teach us the right answer. And at the end of the day, I stuck with it. We did a couple pivots, couple changes, sold the company, bought another company. Man, it was over a decade of back and forth in the startup world. And there's the Peter Drucker line, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast," that, I learned pretty darn quickly, because it was the only way that we survived, to be honest, was figuring out how we got people from different disciplines, different backgrounds, aligned and moving, together was, shared understanding of the problems we were trying to solve, and a lot of transparency about what was working, what wasn't in the business.
What were the other key elements of culture that you found were so critical?
A couple of things. Transparency, I'll stick with that a little bit more, because it really, I think, was key. And it's one that I hold dearly to this day. And I've seen work as I've grown and gone on to bigger companies and other places. If you dial your head back to the early aughts, which a lot of the audience hopefully can, the dot-com bust was not a lot of fun. And so leading through that, there was a point in time when I laid off more people than I'd ever hired in my life, because part of the job was getting us to a place where we could survive. It was pretty clear we needed to do it because there was no money left, and we had to get the company profitable. In doing that, though, one of the things that we did was we got really transparent about the P&L, about the balance sheet, about where we were, about what we needed to achieve. And there's a lot of risk in that, right? Because you're opening up the books to people who are looking at it and saying, I may not have this company may not be here in 6 months to a year. But you hire adults. Don't treat them like children. Don't assume that they don't figure that out for themselves. And, we just decided as a group that it was much better to be open and honest with them than not. And that was, fantastic learning along the way. There also were just a lot of elements of getting to know each other and spending time together. We did the classic sort of Friday morning, team meeting type of thing, but we also made breakfast. Michael Schaffer was my chief technology officer for a while, and Michael, myself, and one or two others would on Friday mornings make breakfast together. And there's still an element to that I carry forward to this day, which is there's still the importance of at least a regular, call it quarterly, getting your team together, breaking of bread, physical activity. Maybe it's a volunteer thing. Maybe it's a hike in the woods. That I think really is about, people getting to understand and know each other better, spending time in shared space, on an episodic basis that I think is just rejuvenating.
Totally agree. Then you moved to Google as a product manager. Seems like that's a very different area for you to be in.
The interesting part was I did have the technical thing down because I've been, I was CEO, but also had been, in charge of basically transforming and changing an e-commerce company into a marketplace, and then bought and sold a SaaS company, a tool provider. And all of that required getting much deeper in understanding of, from a product perspective, what drives users, what do they buy, what do they sell.
For sure.
The fun part of the story, though, is I went to Google as a business development guy. Google hired me first to do deals in e-commerce because I'd been in that space for a while.
Right.
And about a year into that, and I went to Google, to be honest, for, again, this is one of those things where it's like the career is not exactly linear. I went to Google because in part it was resume redemption. It was an opportunity for me to work in a bigger company that people had heard of before in the technology space, as opposed to the decade I'd spent in startups, Libris and Monsoon. So I took the job and had a sort of a sponsor who said to me, hey, look, if it works out in a year, we'll pull you over into the product side of life, which is what we know you want to do. And we'll see where it goes. And so about a year into it, sure enough, there's a product called Google Express, which was a same-day delivery service, which was a business Google probably shouldn't have been in the first place. It had a series of challenges along the way. And the couple of folks who had sort of started it left Google. And so Samir, who had been the guy who was my sort of sponsor starting this thing off, came to me and said, hey, would you, we talked about it. Are you willing to take this thing on? I said, yeah, absolutely. And it was a bit of an albatross, to be honest. It wasn't like the world's sexiest Google product ever. But it was a team that I could see potential in a way to sort of, there were things you could do with it that made a lot of sense in terms of turning it into, sort of a full stack commerce play for Google from a product perspective. But first job was culture. There were product problems like crazy. There were strategy problems that were huge. But the core issue was you had people who weren't talking to one another, who weren't listening to one another. And in some cases, they were shouting in the hallways. We also had some more deeply rooted diversity issues that were showing up in that team that I think were showing up, that showed up later in more of Google. But it was because we had a team and a product that was more mixed in terms of gender, age, ethnicity, than a lot of your classic sort of technology products, because we had operations as well as engineering. So I just ended up spending a lot of time figuring out how to help that team operate better together, helping people figure out whether or not they were actually a good fit with what we wanted to do and how we wanted to operate as a team. And again, it was about getting cultural alignment, getting alignment around purpose, getting cultural alignment, getting people who were more experienced to occasionally sit on their hands and listen to people who are more junior, who may have had a different idea of how to do things, and giving them the space to bring those ideas forward. And it was a great experience. It was hard. It was gnarly, but we made a lot of changes to that business, to the team. But I'm really proud of, at the end of the day, the team that we built as a group. One of the issues we had with that team at Google was not just that junior people weren't being listened to, but we had a team that was geographically distributed, sort of like today. The vast majority of the team did not sit in Mountain View, California, but because it was headquarters, because it had all the senior people, was sort of the command center. So we would have all these quote unquote hybrid meetings, right? Where you would have a bunch of people dialed in from different locations, but you'd have this big room in Mountain View. And we ended up doing things that I still carry forward to this day, but it was basically, how do you let people be heard even through that aspect of things? Like, the person on the video call always wins. GVC, Google Video Conference, is what it was called at the time. So literally, there were signs in the conference rooms that says GVC always wins, number one. Number two, who's your hybrid meeting moderator? Who's the person sitting in front of the screen making sure they're pointing to the fact that Sally is trying to get a word in? We built these things that were placards that ended up showing up not just in the office spaces that we used, but we would see them showing up in other buildings because people would literally copy physical paper and take them to different places. So we were figuring out, like, how do you make distributed teams work? what I've been doing at Google with Google Express it was a marketplace. I'd done marketplaces before. Google, was partnered up with Target and Walmart and Whole Foods and Walgreens and a bunch of other companies in the US. And so it was like, how do you get them all to play nice together? Slack hired me to be the general manager of their platform. So the platform at Slack integrates all the other tools people use at work. So it integrates, Gmail and Outlook and Zoom and Workday and Salesforce and all of these other tools into the Slack experience. So it's easier for you to find and get access to those. So from a subject matter perspective, it was very similar in that respect. From a product perspective, it was completely different. And so I joined them in 2017. The origin story of Slack is based on the fact that the team itself was distributed. So it was Stuart Butterfield, Cal Henderson, who were the two main co-founders, the CEO and the CTO, had been building a game company, a massively multiplayer online game called Glitch. And the game never took off. And what Cal and Stuart did for the second time in their careers was said, well, that's not working. But in the background, what we've been doing is we've been stitching together this piece of infrastructure that they called Slack. That's their, communications backbone, because they themselves were distributed. Stuart and some of the team was up in Vancouver. Cal was down here in California. There was a couple of developers in New York, et cetera. And it was the way in which they, structured their work and made it work. When I joined Slack in 2017, though, the company itself and almost all of our partners were hugely office-based. I mean, literally my team sat in we were almost all co-located in one space, 9 to 5, 5 days a week in the office was sort of the expectation of where and how work got done. And in fact, one of the challenges my team had was the company had grown so fast. They were sort of in this honestly highly questionable space, sort of across the street and around the corner from the main headquarters. And they felt isolated and lonely and disconnected from the mothership. And they were literally a block and a half away.
When we have had different offices, that has been effectively distributed work, even though it wasn't people working from home. As you go to Slack, Slack is evolving. You may have been observing the different ways that people are using the product. What led you then to found Future Forum? Obviously, the timing is very critical. It started in May 2020. So I imagine it was born of the pandemic. But were there threads that were coming through prior to the pandemic that caused you to say, okay, this is what we need to do and why? Because this is part of the trajectory that we've actually been on.
Three things really came together. One was the fact that Stuart himself had this sort of desire for Slack to have what he used to term Center for the Future of Work, a think tank that Slack was backing. Even when I joined back in 2017, he was talking about this. And there have been a couple of efforts to figure out what that would be and what it would look like, but it never quite got off the ground because the timing was never quite right. Second big reason was Slack has a fantastic research team. Christina Janzer leads it to this day. She is really amazing. And Slack invested really heavily in two things, customer support, customer service early on, but also research, really deep understanding of not just how people are using Slack, the product, but what makes for more effective teams, what problems are humans encountering at work that we can potentially help solve. And that work, like what happens in a lot of research organizations inside of companies, never sees the light of day from a public perspective.
Right.
And so those two ingredients, and then you hit the pandemic. And you also dial back to, Brian's experiences, leading and managing distributed teams, my understanding of culture, and go all the way back to that Harvard Business School case study writer who is kind of a research geek. It was just the right time. So Stuart, myself, a couple other folks talked and said, hey, look, if we're ever going to do it, now is the time to do it because people are much more open to new ways of working. And a lot of leaders are asking a lot of questions of conventional wisdom that we haven't heard ever in our lifetimes.
At the same time, you're general manager of Slack.
Yep.
And the company is going through an extraordinary situation, incredibly important for so many people who are forced to be working from home. How does it come to be you who's going to step to the side to this very important work, and who's going to be the general manager? You've left a hole, haven't you?
Yeah, I did. Let me fill that hole for you. So there's two other factors that you need to know. Like, okay, let's give you the first one, which is we've established the fact that Brian will occasionally take on things that are much different in order to learn, and that are also much smaller than the last thing he did. By the way, at the end of the startup, I had 350 people working for me. Jumped to Google, where I had 2 employees when I first started.
Okay.
When I left Google, I had over 1,000 people working for me, including over 400 engineers. I'm not an engineer, and that doesn't happen at Google very often. And I go to Slack, where there's a team of, roughly speaking, 30 people working with me. I'm not a subject matter expert in APIs, in application programming interfaces, and the needs of developers and engineers. So we actually went out and recruited Steve Wood and Rukmini Reddy to come in and co-lead the platform team that I'd been leading. Steve has done this a number of times before, and Rukmini is an amazing engineering leader. And it was because I'd sort of hit that point where it's like, I'm not the right person to take this to the next stage. At the same time, one of the things that I had done with Slack on its journey was a lot of external-facing communications. I've done a fair amount of press. I actually was involved in our going public, in our roadshow, in our Investor Day presentation. And so the team knew that I am also pretty good if you want to get a message out there to the public. And so it was sort of a mutual, like, it's time to do something different with the developer platform team. Let's get Steve and Rukmini to lead this. And I'm going to go over here and do this thing for the third time in my career, which is I'm going to step down from a big job into what seems like a smaller job, but where, from my perspective, I'm going to learn a lot. I'm going to place a bet that I can have a lot of impact doing this. And there's one more bit to that too, Sophie, let me give you real quick, which is I didn't do it alone. It was also an opportunity to grab a couple of people that I had not worked with directly, but knew from Slack really well and loved. Helen Kopp and Sheila Subramanian, and get the two of them to join me on this thing. And they were my co-founders of it, and we each brought different skills to it. But, again, I think for everyone out there, like, think about what you want. What's your career giving you? And, how are you learning? How are you growing? And then sometimes it's taking a risk.
Okay, so now we're at the platform looking at the future of work. And as far as I'm concerned, the future of work arrived just about then, the beginning of the pandemic. And as you say in your book, How the Future Works, and the co-authors with Brian are the two people that he just mentioned. In it, you talk about the fact that obviously there was a huge jump change with the pandemic, but the nature of work had been changing prior to the pandemic.
That's right.
And going back to Henry Ford, but also way before that, Robert Owen in 1817 came out originally with the 8 hours of leisure, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of work. Why did it take till 1938 for the US government to make that law? And from your book, I learned for the first time that Henry Ford clearly had worked with different days a week, 5 days a week, 6 days a week, 8 hours a day. So he was experimenting then.
Yeah, because everything was so new and so fresh from an industrial age perspective, that people didn't have this sort of ruts that had been developed. Ford was, I think, the ones that did do the 5-day work week. It makes more sense. What's the trade-offs? And it turns out that it worked. It was an experiment that they ended up sticking with and doing. And in fact, I'm pretty sure they then subsequently tested the 4-day work week, found that it worked, but for some reason that's unclear from time, but I think we can all kind of guess and speculate, went back to 5 days anyway. And I think it's because it had become so established as the norm and the conventional wisdom, and maybe it felt, maybe from sort of a puritanical perspective, like there was just an insufficient amount of work being done.
And it was very arbitrary. And obviously we can change it. We came up with something before. It was relatively arbitrary then. So we can have a look at what might make more sense based on where we are now.
Yeah, we have so many systems that we've inherited from other systems that we don't change and question. I mean, in the U.S. in particular, the public schooling system which has a 2 to 3 month summertime break from an agrarian calendar perspective. When I grew up in farm country in the U.S., there's not much left in terms of that part of the population. The 9 to 5 in the office work week was an invention of offices which were literally factories, right? So an office was a factory because you had rows of desks with people running paper up and down the desks, because paper was the work that was being done, and it was being moved from station to station. And it was a factory. It just happened to be, a different type of work that was being done.
Right.
And we spent decades and decades and decades not questioning that, even while technology changed really fundamentally, even while demographics changed really fundamentally, even while the nature of the work itself became a lot less rote over, decades.
Exactly.
And we still found ourselves in that rut. And by the way, we still do today. Because I think a lot of what you're seeing is because I, as a leader, experienced things as I was growing up that led to my success in the 1980s and the 1990s and the aughts. I believe that that's the recipe for success. And therefore, I think that the rest of you should follow my example. Unfortunately, a lot of the people that are doing that are the people who have been successful because that system worked for them, because they weren't the primary caregiver, because they were, sorry, I'll say it out loud, it's me, it's 50-something-year-old white male, cis, not the primary caregiver more often than not. And those systems worked really well for those folks. They did well. They thrived through it. Maybe not psychologically all the time, but it paid them. And why change it?
Yes. At the same time, those are also the leaders who were breaking new models, were pioneering in where they were going. And that's how they rose to those positions. And yet now, do you think it's because there was so much change going on in how we operate, pivoting for customers, all these different elements? Is it because there was a desire, a need to have something which is more stable? Why does this seem to be one particular element that seems to be so backward looking?
First, I think there's a variety of different leaders out there. And there are a number of leaders who are taking a much more progressive stance, obviously, right? And not just in technology, but we could talk about, Allstate or MasterCard or Cotopaxi, my favorite retail brand at the moment. But those that are stuck, I think it's at the heart of this, unfortunately, lies a real core issue, which is trust.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a specific example that I think might be helpful, which is leaders. We all had this moment during the pandemic where things were going really sideways for a number of people, but everybody kind of had one mission, one shared experience in a lot of ways, right? Which is everybody was remote. And it's just the way that it was working at that point in time. And even if you were uncomfortable with it, you had to deal with it and you had to make it work. And from a business perspective, by the way, by and large, it worked. And I think that surprised a lot of people and opened up their eyes and all the rest of it. I think what happened in particular over the course of the last year is we've seen the economic challenges growing. We've to some degree had a lot of challenges on that front. The other thing that's been happening is executives start coming back into the office more often. And they're coming back into offices that are largely empty, that are, even if they are pushing.
It doesn't feel great.
Even for those, no, it doesn't. And even for those that are pushing hard, even for those that have said 3 days a week in the office is the rule, they're getting 1.5, right? Which means they're not getting what they expected out of it. And they're looking around and going, how do I know these people are really working? And I've had these conversations with a lot of people, and the question often comes back to a couple of things, which is, what are you doing to measure outcomes in the business, right? What are you doing to see how the business is performing, how your teams are performing? What are you doing to train your managers to do that? But the other part is, how involved are the executives themselves in where the work is happening? And this is sort of from my Slack days and experience that I had. One of the things I ended up doing with a lot of executives on the side was coaching them how to use Slack. Because their teams would be using it. And by the way, whether it's Slack or Microsoft Teams or a lot of the other tools, a lot of executives sit in the state of, not only do they have the corner office, but lunch gets brought to them, and they're in email. Right? Yeah. I'm in email, and by the way, maybe you can text message me if you've got a relationship that way. But if you want to find me, you find me in email. And Slack or Teams is for the kids, for the teams. And what's happening when they're coming back into these offices is they're seeing these empty spaces. And if you dial back, I was leading a company in 2008, 2009 during the last downturn. during a downturn, if you're coming in and everybody's there, you're feeling the buzz and the vibe and the conversation. If you're coming back now and you're not feeling that buzz and vibe, you're even more worried that people don't get the challenges that the company's facing.
For sure.
The challenge is those conversations are happening, but they're happening in Slack and they're happening in Teams. And if the executive's not in where the team is, then they have another challenge. They feel excluded, and they're on the outside and they're not seeing the buzz and they're not seeing the noise. And by the way, we're now 2 generations of digital natives in the workforce.
Yeah.
I've got, kids entering the workforce now, kids in quotes. Both of them have never answered an email from me in their lives. I'm pretty confident. If it becomes important enough. Actually, most of the time that involves me texting them to remind them to look at the email to tell me which one.
That is exactly what I tell my son. I have forwarded an email to you, now you have to go and find it.
Exactly. I need you to do something with this. But yeah, it's that, so we have, a lot of folks now getting, closing in on half the workforce that grew up with an iPhone in their hands, right? And messaging is second nature to them, and building, certainly maintaining relationships, if not building relationships, happens online all the time. And so as executives, we're used to, building relationships, building connection, building culture, because it's the all hands that we host, and it's the slogans on the wall, and it's the meals that we have for people, and it's the events that we have. And you know what? That's a part of it, but that's not the majority of where that culture and connection actually happens. And it's not just about the digital tools, but that is a big part of it. So if I don't trust that my workforce is really working, and I'm not in the tools where they're operating, and I've not moved to something that's much more, outcomes driven management, then it's not surprising that even though I may be a progressive, moving forward type of leader, I'm looking at the situation and going, we just need to meet at least in the middle. I need people back 3 days a week.
So they're not just not in the same physical spaces, they're not in the same virtual spaces either. So there is a complete disconnect.
That's right.
And that goes to the energy and buzz, and therefore undermines the trust. So what I feel is going to be the future of the company, if I feel so disconnected, or I don't get a sense of how everybody else is helping move it forward, that's one element of wanting to bring everybody back together.
I'll give you an example. One of the public sector federal government agencies in the U.S. that I was working with on this said, we've got sizable parts of the organization that are very distributed, and we've got a senior leadership suite that's literally back in their suite, their nicely paneled offices. And they're missing out on this. And, I reached out to them through Teams and sent one of them a message, and he didn't respond. And what this other executive was saying is, what I realized is, I then talked to him about it. He said, "Oh yeah, I don't use that." And what and that person explained to him is like, your team actually is in there. They're in there all the time, all day long. You don't have to do a lot in it, but you should at least get in there and watch it, so that you're seeing the conversations happening, the buzz, the questions they're asking, the discoveries that they're making.
Right.
And if you do that, at least you're in the virtual spaces where it's happening. And the answer is going to end up being a blend of both. We need people to come together, to build relationships, but we definitely can, continue them virtually as well.
There are various articles recently about employers, managers, executives saying productivity is going down. And for me, some of those are certainly temporary. And the question is, why is it happening? And let's make sure that we're identifying what the cause is and paying attention to the research and understanding and asking employees in your company what is going on and where the issues are. There still are so many companies that aren't asking lots of questions of their employees. Is that what you're finding as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And we see this. There's a trust gap too that's built that way. In Future Forum's research, what we found was that it's something like 70 some odd % of executives say they're being transparent in their planning about the future of work, and only about 40% of employees agree with them. But at the same time, 2/3 of executives tell us that they're doing their future work planning with little to no direct input from their employees. Like, well, why do you think they don't trust that you're being transparent?
Right.
And we know that, executives themselves don't always have the right point of view. There's actually a great piece that just came out about how Deloitte handled this. Their executive suite was doing their own discussions around this and figured out, we're going to get transparent on this.
I saw this article.
Yeah.
And he basically said, I want everybody involved in it. That was
Exactly.
very cool.
And we've also seen is the anecdotal storytelling that happens in the executive suite can unfortunately, drive the policy, right? Which is, well, my son has the following experience, and therefore, from a younger worker perspective, I believe they all need to be back in the office and want to be back in the office more often. And so one of the things that they found was that group of people that are early on in their career are just as spread out in terms of their desires and what they're looking for as people 3 decades in.
Right.
And by the way, we found this in our own research too. The sort of Gen Zs are the ones that are least likely to want to be fully remote. They're also least likely to want to be 5 days a week in the office.
Yes, I think it's from Nick Bloom's data. It says 2.57 days per week working from home for Gen Zs and 3.01 for 55 and over. Because they probably have nicer space and better setup.
Exactly.
There's still the issue, let's just say for your sons who are just starting or about to go into the workplace, helping them actually learn how to work. And I want to focus on this apprenticeship word.
No, it's a fantastic question.
Because there are so many people who are saying, that's how I learned, that's the best way to do it. How can we help Gen Zs learn how to work, particularly when a lot of people have never actually clarified exactly how they learn to work and how they're working? How can managers really clarify what they're doing, how they're doing it, how that they can be giving helpful direction and support and guidance to younger folks in a really evolving workplace? How can we do that?
I'm going to zoom out for 1 second and say, like, any one of these problems somebody brings forward, I love it. Because then if we're sitting there saying, hey, as an executive team, we're focused on one issue, then we can go deeper and dig it. If what we're saying is we're worried about productivity and innovation and culture and connection and new employee development, there's no way you're going to solve all that, right? And so what you're saying is, I give up, throw my hands in the air, we're going backwards. And my answer to that one is good luck to you, because the world does not go backwards. The world goes forwards, and the pace of change is not slowing down. For any one of these things, though, then the next step is let's dig in and think through how we intentionally design that process in the first place.
Right.
So, and by the way, let's not rely on random chance as our method for developing human beings, because that's kind of what you're saying otherwise, right? And the classic random chance method is you throw people into an office space, you throw them onto a team, they sit in an open office floor plan, and you hope they find somebody they can tap on the shoulder to help them out.
And interrupt their work.
Exactly. And by the way, who does that work for? It works for the majority. It works for white men better than it does for Black women engineers, right? It just does, because they have an easier time breaking into that and finding friends and going to the happy hour and all the rest of it. Instead, here's the thought process. Let's think about how we onboard people in the first place. Let's think about not only the composition of the team that they're being tossed into and the manager they're getting, but what our mentorship program looks like. How do we give them a mentor who's somebody just a year or two ahead of them that sits in an adjacent team? Second, how do we think about networking and helping them build networks? Genpact out of Europe has one of my favorite practices, which is everybody as they're onboarded gets given 6 people to connect with outside of their team, and preferably outside of their function.
Like that.
Those 6 people are supposed to then each give them 2 to 3 more people to connect with. So what you're doing is intentionally building networks to help people get connected to the organization.
And supplement the weak link issue.
Exactly. And start building those relationships. You can also do some of this through tooling. There's a lovely app called Donut in Slack, but I've seen people build their own that basically does round robin coffee assignments. You give them a group of humans, right? You give them a layer of your management team, or you give them 2 teams that you want to meet one another, and it randomly pairs them up over whatever period of time you set to have coffee together. And the coffee can be virtual, it can be in person, whatever your setup is. But each of those steps is a real way in which you're building connections, mentoring people, and finding a way to land them that's much more effective. And we know that if we can do that, especially in the first 6 to 9 months of an employee's employment, their odds are a lot higher, because it's really that first 6 to 9 months that's formative in terms of whether or not they're able to build those connections to help them learn and understand the organization as they go forward. Then the rest of this goes back to basically really good management practices, which is how do you give feedback? When do you give feedback? And how do we train managers to give it? And I love there's a woman named Sidal Neely at Harvard Business School. I think she's the one that had the line first about we've always had a mediocre management problem. The pandemic just exposed it for what it was, right? And if your management technique is monitoring whether or not humans are showing up in a space or not, you're probably going to have some performance issues. They're going to show up in the outcomes of your organization. So aren't we much better off thinking through how we train managers to do two really core things? One is giving timely, actionable, specific feedback to people so that they develop. And you can do that with a phone call after a client meeting. And two, how do we think about outcomes-driven management? How do we think about what impact someone is having and how their team is performing, as opposed to just, rote productivity measures that are honestly gameable?
Right. I did a very big client project about productivity. And the idea was to have a generalized one-size-fits-all productivity index. And I said, it's just not possible.
No.
So they had to scrap it.
The productivity conversation makes me crazy as well. I think that what we generally are trying to do is measure inputs and outputs. And inputs and outputs are all gameable. And you can see it in the behavior of people. My favorite is the sort of keystroke monitoring type of stuff. And the fact that for $25 on Amazon, you can buy a mouse jiggler that will occasionally jiggle your mouse for you. In the words of one Wall Street chief people officer, also, how'd you know I was working even when I was in the office? Because I guarantee you I wasn't all the time. So it's the wrong direction. But you're right, Sophie. Moving to outcomes-driven management is challenging because you have to actually figure out what outcomes you're trying to drive, and the outcomes that a product and engineering team are responsible for are different from a sales organization, are different from a marketing organization.
I've always worked in strategy. How do you measure productivity of someone who's doing strategy?
Oh my gosh!
Did I produce a great presentation every 3 months? From a personal perspective, I was in the worst possible place.
So you and I could probably generate more PowerPoint slides than are useful if we really wanted to.
Well, now with ChatGPT, we're golden.
Exactly.
Since I just mentioned generative AI within that, if everything wasn't changing fast enough, I think that is really, for me, one of the key, potentially new catalysts to help reticent leaders to understand that we all must be flexible, because every single person's job is going to be changing somewhat, in all likelihood, over the next 2 to 3 years. There have been quite a lot of negative media headlines, and the articles haven't been necessarily quite as bad as the headlines. There've also been some changes, some people pulling back. I mean, Google actually now is stopping some of the people from working remotely. How do we keep moving forward in the right direction?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. And that's one of the reasons why in the book and How the Future Works, we also talked about Nadia Rawlinson, who was our chief people officer at the time, had this phrase, when we're debating our own use of the office and what were we doing at Slack going forward, Nadia's phrase was, hold on, before we get started, I need to understand what lens to apply. Are we looking backwards? Are we going back to what we did before? Or are we starting from today and taking what worked in the past and adding it back to what we're doing today? And that orientation of are we returning or are we redesigning forward is kind of what's sat at the heart of a lot of our work.
Right.
And I think for a lot of organizations, what you're seeing is this sort of this tug of war that's happening inside of them. And I think, the ones that are continuing to experiment, iterate, see what works, and invest behind new ways of working will come out better in the long run, because evolutions like generative AI are going to continue to change the nature of how work gets done, which really means what you need to move towards is an outcomes-driven means of management, right? Because if that's the way that you're doing it, and a continual learning, continual iteration cycle in how we work, the how question is the one that, we spend so much time debating how many days a week somebody should be in the office. It's ridiculous. The amount of time and energy that's spent on this.
That has been wasted, yes.
But it's been wasted. And the resentment that it builds up in employees around it too is also one of the things that sort of dumbfounds me, because let's put it this way. A lot of those larger scale organizations know that their teams themselves were distributed pre-pandemic, right? So go back to my Google example. But the average large tech organization probably only might have had 60, maybe 70% of its teams physically co-located in the same city pre-pandemic. That number now is almost inverted. It's like 30 to 40%. And so if you're saying to people, I need you back in 3 days a week, and the 3 days are Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday because team building, and literally half of your organization sits there and goes, but my team's not all co-located in the same city, let alone the same building, chief.
Right.
It's not a wonder that they're kind of resentful of the demand. What people want is they want, 1 to 2 days a week on average, and that's on average. And what they want is to figure out the patterns and rhythms that work for their teams. Now, why aren't leaders doing that? Because you have to invest behind that. You have to put work behind it. And you have to rely on managers to be good to do it. One of my favorite recent stories, though, on that one is one of the organizations that I've worked with did this. In 2021, they announced 2 days a week was the right answer, but you need back 2 days. They didn't get that. So in 2022, they announced 3 days a week was the right answer. And they also didn't get that. And so what they figured out is like, this isn't working. They then put all of their senior leadership through a training program we piloted with them around building team level agreements. So 200 senior leaders globally, because they've got teams that are sizable enough that the needs of a finance team is different from an engineering team, is different from a business unit in Brazil. Like, what are the rules of the road for us?
And for each specific team is made of different people as well. And so the needs of one finance team versus another, they have to be equitable, but they have different combinations of who wants to work where and when.
That's right. And you want to have guardrails that are like, what are the extremes, right? Like one of the things that we always promoted at Slack was we really want teams to get together at least once a quarter on the far extreme, right? And on the other extreme, we don't want executives coming into the office more than 3 days a week. Because if you're coming on 5 days a week, you're sending a signal to your team. So think about it within that constraint. But still with 200, one of the concerns that I get with these programs is, well, with that many leaders, we know that a lot of them are just going to check the box on that exercise. My answer to that is great. What we then do is it's pretty easy to tell who did the check the box, who just sort of filled out the form versus their team spent time on this and engaged in it. Let's go back and look at the employee engagement scores and the outcomes metrics to the extent we have it for the people who took the time to do it well.
Right.
And I can pretty much guarantee you that just that act of actually spending the time understanding, what are the objectives for our team, how do we work together, and listening to their team say, here's what's going to, quote unquote, unlock my productivity, is going to make your organization a lot more effective. And time will tell. It's an ongoing evolution.
It is. And I also see the effect of leaders, particularly senior executives, saying these things which don't sound rational or logical. And it undermines their credibility, which doesn't help. Because otherwise, as a young person at a company, do I really believe that this company is competitive if the leadership does not seem to be moving with the times? To one particular issue that you were talking about, I think it was 83 or 84% of US employees, maybe it was global research, who are wanting to be working in different locations, to have a hybrid model, to have remote work options. But 91 or maybe 93% wanted flexible hours. And pre-pandemic, Kate Lister has told me that was also the case. Why aren't employers willing to give flexible hours if that's what people really want?
We have this disease called meetings, Sophie. It's a horrible disease. I was about to say this earlier. If an executive says to their employees, I'm worried about productivity, so therefore the answer is I need you back in the office 3 days a week, everybody looks at them and says, what you're saying is you don't trust me. If an executive says, I have concerns, or I think we have a problem with productivity, and I think we have too many meetings, you know what happens? Everybody cheers. Because executives agree with this, and so do their employees. I don't think we published this formally, but one of the things we did last winter was we did a study, and one of the things we were looking at was use of time and how time works. And when we polled executives, what they told us was that on average, nearly half of their meetings could be eliminated in their organization with little to no discernible impact. Okay,
really, almost half.
When you ask executives. Yeah, and when you ask executives, well, you think you've got a meeting problem. What do you think is driving it? The anecdotal answer you get quite often is, well, it's FOMO. It's fear of missing out. It's the fact that people just won't drop out of the meeting because they think if they're not there. There's some truth to that. But in our survey results, 40% of the problem is you made me show up at this meeting. It was mandatory. Okay. The next biggest reason was it turns out it was a waste of my time. And then the FOMO was like 13 or 15%. So the biggest problem is we spend our days stumbling into our calendar, to be honest. We wake up in the morning, we look at our calendars, hopefully before we start the day, and then we get into it and we go through it. And the pandemic made this worse because the 30-minute video call became the solution for every known problem.
Right.
And what happened is we can see this in burnout statistics, in particular for middle managers. Your frontline manager is the one that often carries an individual burden as well as being in a heck of a lot of meetings. And so we pulled this internally at Slack. And how much focus time do people have during working hours? 2-hour plus uninterrupted blocks of time? Almost none. Right. And so you shove their core individual work into the evening after the kids are in bed or after dinner, and you wonder why they're burnt out. And so I think the challenge, though, is it's kind of like that the rows of desks in the office. We don't have another way of working, and we're sort of used to that being the case. And people get really scared about putting in place impediments. So I'm going to describe two of them, and both of these actually work pretty well at Slack in particular, and I've seen them in other places. One is really easy. We talked about the 4-day work week. We ended up not doing it for a variety of reasons, including like how it would work across an organization where you have customer support and sales that has to pair up with their partners. Setting that aside, Focus Fridays was no internal meetings on Fridays. The specific sets of rules that we talked through and landed on were you can still take customer meetings on Fridays because the customer wins. And you can still do interviews of job candidates because often job candidates are much more flexible on Fridays and can have that conversation. But we want to kill off the internal meetings. And the biggest impediment to that program was the executive suite themselves, because executives spend their days in meetings, right? And rightfully, a couple of them asked, what's supposed to give on my calendar? The team wants to meet with me. The one-downs need to happen, all the rest of it. And the answer was, that's great, but all the team meetings, the one-downs, everything else into Monday through Thursday, meet amongst yourselves on Fridays as much as you want to. And in particular, do not book time with anybody director level or below. And people kind of looked around the room and nodded and said, okay, let's give it a shot and let's see if we can make this work. And then through doing that and continual reinforcement, we basically built this program up. We had 85% of employees saying that this was a moderate or significant benefit for them.
Great.
I had a group in Australia. I had a leader in Australia offer to trade off the Focus Fridays thing for instead, I'll give you 1 day off period, like completely off per month. And the answer was no, not taking it, because you're going to fill that day with meetings, everything else with meetings. And then I'm going to spend all that Friday off, catching up on work.
Right.
So we have to put constraints in place. We have to make it okay for people to say no to meetings. We have to, try new ways of working to get there. And if we can, that focus time element, that flexibility in schedules is huge.
Exactly. With more focus on asynchronous work and the tools, the documentation, recording meetings that people can look and search through later are other elements in terms of how to get rid of so many meetings and how to proactively and intentionally design how we're working, including where a meeting is necessary and how to make it as brief and productive as possible.
Absolutely. I was going to say that even in the book, Helen, Sheila, and I described what we did with our team, which was 9 a.m. until 1 o'clock on the West Coast of the U.S. was our core collaboration hours. You were expected Monday through Thursday during those hours to be available not only for meetings, but for quick conversations, for a Zoom, for a huddle in Slack, for a phone call.
Right.
And that way you had that expectation, because it is important for people to have time in sync. But they gave people time outside of that. And it meant that you also have to get better at, not only having the meeting, but sharing the outcomes of the meeting, what got discussed, what got decided, and how to get decided, so people don't have the FOMO and other issues too.
how that's going to happen. Is somebody going to take notes? Is it going to be recorded? We have a lot more tools at our disposal to be able to change the dynamics and make all this work much better. Two things for your sons as they're coming into the workplace. What is your belief for them as they're coming into the labor market? But also, what do you hope for them? And what do you believe there's going to be the workplace in 5 or even crazy 10 years' time?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, the most fundamental for me is I just hope that they are happy. At the end of the day, I want my sons to be healthy, happy individuals and people. And I really hope that, the sort of hustle culture stuff that infected me, that infected a lot of people, doesn't transmute through. I think there are fantastic ways to be very effective and very good at your job that don't involve the presenteeism and the sort of hustle culture showing up aspects of it that I think are not good for us as a society. And so the most fundamental for me is I hope they live balanced lives and are happy. I think from a workplace perspective, I hope that they continue to learn and grow and both challenge themselves, but also get the support they need to be, good workers, quote unquote, but also, ongoing learners from a kind of like some of the stuff that I've done, but also, supported in ways of doing that. The third one is, there's a really big aspect that I'm already seeing in them and in their generation, not only around the need to balance work and life and make the world a better place, but also just a much broader sense of belonging and inclusion with a broader group of people that makes me proud. But I think, is also for them, even still for the coming, decade plus, going to be an ongoing wrestling match with, folks who don't see it that way or don't quite get it or have a hard time seeing through other people's eyes. I think this generation sees through each other's eyes in ways that could be really instructive for all the rest of us if we would just give it a shot.
Wholeheartedly agree with that. And Brian, last of all, for a company that is in the throes of this transformation, potentially going through productivity dip or having some challenges, what is your advice to the managers or executives, what they can be thinking about, what they could focus on when there are many simultaneous issues that they could be dealing with?
Yeah, I'd say number one is figure out what problem you're trying to solve. Productivity in and of itself is this highly questionable measure in the first place, but clearly there's some outcome that your organization's not achieving, whether that's sales growth or whether that's cost savings or whether that's new product innovation. Find one of those that you want to focus on, because I'm pretty sure most executive suites have at least one that's major. Second, go listen to your people. Engage them directly in the conversation. And it doesn't have to be everybody like Deloitte did. It can be a select group of people, but it needs to be a select group of people that management does trust, but that is also representative of the broader population of your employees in terms of function, in terms of diversity, in terms of global coverage. Those people that you both trust and that have a diverse perspective are going to bring to you the ground truth of what's going on inside of your organization in ways that you may not have visibility into. And so they'll help you understand what it is that they need in order to solve the problem you're trying to solve. So that's really the heart of it at the end of the day. There's plenty of frameworks that we can provide, through the book, through research, but it's what problem we're trying to solve. How do we engage our employees directly and preferably as transparently as possible in helping us solve that, because they'll rise to the occasion. People want to drive better outcomes, and they want to tell you what problems need to be fixed in order for them to be more effective. You just have to listen.
Brian, thank you so much for everything. We've gone long. There has been so much to talk about because these are gnarly issues. We're going through a challenging period, and I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Sophie, thank you. It's been a fantastic conversation. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you again so much to Brian Elliott, veteran executive leader, advisor, speaker, and best-selling author. You can follow Brian on LinkedIn, as well as find out more about Brian's book, How the Future Works, at howthefutureworks.org. Immediate action tip. First, figure out what problem you are trying to solve. Second, engage directly with a trusted representative group of the broader employee population. who will help you understand what they need in order to solve this problem and listen to them. If you enjoy this podcast, please write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular video updates, curated useful articles, research and information, please follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter at @SophieWade. You can also sign up for my regular Work in Progress newsletters on LinkedIn. Until next time.